Gary Vacon.
No? Can you do it for me, Shannon? Next slide. Okay. Thanks. Imagine a perfect day in Vineyard Sound. I mean perfect. I decided to go fishing. This isn't an unusual decision for me, those of you who know me. And I just didn't know that I was about to embark and create a set of events that turned into the biggest and most consequential lie of my life. A lie that I've kept a secret for almost 10 years. I guess until now. It was bluebird perfect. I mean, there wasn't a cloud in the sky, there wasn't a breath of wind. I got my boat in Green Pond and I headed for Middle Ground. Middle Ground is an underwater sandbar, just off of West Chalk. And when I got there, I mean, it's up there, right? When I got there, there was no current running, the tide was slack. I knew that meant the fish would scatter. But it was beautiful. I stopped the boat, I shut the engine off, I climbed up in the gunwale and I looked into the water and you could see the sandbar. It was like in the Caribbean, you could see the sandbar. The sand was so clear, you could see right down, and then you could take it deeper on either side to the dark, deep blue water. And it was just me. I was on the only boat there, just me on this little piece of heaven between Falmouth and the Vineyard. I gotta erase this. All right. So, I said, well, no fish, what am I going to do? But then I saw them on the sandbar. I could see these little shadows coming my way. I knew that they were striped bass. I had my fly rod with me, so I stepped back. I stepped back carefully. I was trying to be quiet. I kept my eye on the fish. I got some line in the air, and at just the right moment, I let the line go, and I watched it roll out in that perfectly smooth water until it got to the very end where there was a little leader and there was a fly tied on the end, and that fly was just a little piece of feathering flash that I had made with a hook on it, and it dropped into that water like a pebble in a mill pond, 10 feet in front of the fish. Let me see, can I make the next one, Shannon? I'm going to have you help me. There we go, thanks, I see your hand. Ah, there it is, there's the fly. Okay, so the fish are coming at me, and I'm excited. My heart rate is going up. I'm tugging on the line. The situation is perfect. I'm tugging on the line, the little fly is dancing, the fish are getting closer. It's that perfect anticipation that every fisherman feels when something good's about to happen. Perfect, wonderful. How did I get like this? I mean, I'm 50. I'm 63 years old, and I'm obsessed with fish. It's just fishing, right? I mean, it's just fishing. Nah, it's never just fishing. It's never just fishing. I first learned to fish when I was just barely old enough to walk. My dad and my uncle took me fishing, and they taught me right away. I'm going to make Shannon do it for me. Shannon, next slide, thanks. They taught me right away that all fishing wasn't created equal. At the bottom of the hierarchy is bait fishing, and bait fishing was to be scorned. Bait fishing is cheating. You don't want to bait fish, never bait fish. In the middle is artificial lures, because you have to kind of fool the fish with artificial lures, but the pinnacle was fly fishing. These guys taught me that fly fishing was the only way. It was the hard way, and they believed you should always do it the hard way. And they were fanatical about this. I remember one time we were fishing up at the North River, up in Pembroke, and my dad's on one side of the river, and my Uncle Bernie's on the other side of the river, and the two of them one says to the other in a loud voice, "Hey, Bernie, I think I smell something," and the other one says, yeah, something stinks. And it was because a couple of bait guys showed up, and they were dissing the bait guys. It's no wonder we weren't beat up, right? And my uncle and my dad, and of the two of them, my uncle was the better fisherman. They were brothers, and brothers are always in a contest. But my uncle was better, and he could tell a better fish story too. My dad loved to fish, but my uncle lived to fish. And it was a lifetime fishing derby with these two guys. Who caught the biggest fish? Who caught the best fish? And fishing was important, and they took me fishing everywhere. My dad was a fuel oil dealer in town. My uncle was the police chief. They brought other business and civic leaders fishing with us, and they encouraged me, at 10 years old, to have a conversation with these guys like I was part of it. This had a big influence on me. a big influence, and they were good men. My dad delivered oil into people's houses that could never afford to pay because they were cold, and it was the right thing to do. And my uncle, he embraced the families that were in trouble. He was the police chief he knew in town and took those kids fishing with us. These were good deeds done without fanfare. There were no Facebook posts. There were no charity galas. They did it because it was the right thing to do. They were good men. And they taught me that, what it meant to be a good guy. But when it came to fishing, they were absolute and unabashed liars. They could tell a fish story that would curl your toes. And when I was a young boy, I was impressionable. I worshipped these guys, and they took advantage of that, and they'd tell these fish stories, and I'd buy them, hook, line, and sinker every time, and they loved it. My uncle told the story about fishing up in Canada. He called this, we fished up in the Miramichi River for salmon, and he called this pool in the river the Quagus. And the Quagus, according to Bernie, was full of these boulders the size of buses, like 15, 20 feet in diameter. You'd have to climb on top of these boulders to fish. And the river ran rapidly between the boulders, according to Bernie, and it was loaded with salmon. And now one day, he says to me, they find this guide in the morning. They go to the pool, and they find this guy dead, face down in the water with his fly rod still in his hand. He's like this. So I said to Bernie, what happened to the guide? What happened to the guide? And he says, obviously, he hooked a large Atlantic salmon, and the salmon swam round and round the rock so many times that the guy got dizzy, he fell off, he hit his head, and he drowned. Now, of course, he never let go of his fly rod. No good fly fisherman ever would, even in death. So I said to Bernie, I'm not afraid. I'm a young guy. What's going to happen? Let's go. Take me to the Quagus. There's fish there. Oh, no. Way too dangerous for a young boy. I was probably 25 when I realized that Quagus was a fabrication. So when I wasn't fishing with these guys, Sharon, can I do the next one? The other way. Okay, so when I wasn't fishing, keep going, one more, there. When I wasn't fishing with these guys, I attended St. Patrick's Parochial School. At St. Patrick's, I learned the value of discipline and the power of guilt. I have to tell you, I got some assignments. I remember this assignment where I had to underline some words for homework, and I made the horrible error of drawing these lines freehand. What a terrible kid I was. And I had to write 100 times, you should underline your words with a ruler. So, when we were in class, we were marched over to the church. And the church for a young boy was a big, intimidating structure. And we sat in these enormous wooden pews. We listened to the priests and the nuns, and they told us these stories of hell and damnation, and we were all sinners. And you probably can tell I still have a few twitches from that experience. Now, although most people, if you ask them about me, they'd say, I'm a logic guy. I'm more of a Spock than McCoy. And I hold some things to be true that are spiritual, that aren't necessarily logical. I believe this without question, that when we die, it's not over. And I don't get there from religious teachings. Religious teachings are fine, but I don't get there that way. I get there because people that have died that have been close to me, I've always felt they had something to say to me that was profound after they died. Okay, so by now you're saying, I thought you were going to come up here and tell me a fish story. What's any of this got to do with fishing? Well, let me assure you that this is not only a fish story, but just about everything is. So we're back in Vineyard Sound, and I'm tugging on that line. Those fish are coming closer. My heart rate is up. It's perfect. I'm all by myself. It's beautiful. And on one of those tugs, I feel the line go tight. I pull the rod up, and the rod doubles over, and that fish takes off for the Elizabeth Islands. Perfect ecstasy. It's wonderful. 10 minutes, a tug of war. That fish gets close to the boat. I see the striped bass in the water. I reach down, grab it between my thumb and my forefingers by the lower lip. This is a technique every bass fisherman knows. I lift the bass up. I put it in the boat. It's about 35 inches of beautiful striped bass. Oh, wonderful. My heart rate comes back to normal, and I head back to Green Pond. My wife meets me there, and Janet, she takes a picture of me holding the fish. So I got my fly rod in this hand and a fish in this hand, And we have a nice dinner that night. And it's not just any fish, you know, because I caught it the right way, the hard way, on a fly rod. I didn't cheat with bait. And it was the first 28-inch, over 28-inch keeper striped bass that I had caught on a fly rod. So I knew Dad and Bernie would be proud. Now, this was all back in 2006. Time goes forward. My dad comes down and fishes with me multiple times on the Cape. And as he got into his 80s, it got to the point where keeping his balance on a small boat was difficult for him. And so my wife and I, we hatched this idea. We said, Dad, why don't you go down and stand on the boat on the dock? So we did. And we posed him with the fly rod in his hand and his hand out like this, like he was holding a fish. But of course, there was no fish there. And, you know, Dad instantly, when you told him he would pretend he was holding a fish, he didn't hold the fish like this. He held the fish like this. Because every fisherman knows that that's the way you take a fish photo for a perspective, right? So we fixed the lack of fish. Being a nerd, it's not that hard to do, right? We had Photoshop. So we cut the fish out of my photo and we pasted it into his hands. Now, that was simple enough, but you know, once you've got it and you've got all this technology in Photoshop, it's not that hard to grab the two corners of the fish. So we did that, and Shannon, one more, okay, and we printed this photo. We printed this photo, and it came out great. I mean, come on. So we framed it, and we sent Dad home with it. And when Dad got home, he immediately hung it up in his porch. And there's a chair he liked to sit in his porch, and he hung it up behind that chair because people would come to visit him and talk to him, and you know, he'd have to explain the photo every time, right? So my uncle came to see him, and my uncle was the better fisherman, and he was very perturbed. I mean, my dad had caught a bigger striped bass than my uncle had ever caught on a fly rod. How was this possible? My uncle, you know, but my dad never flinched. He said, you know, no, yeah, I caught this. He told an elaborate story. And then Bernie called me up. He would call me up and he said, Gary, you know, did your dad really catch that fish? Did he catch the fish? And I said, of course he did, Bernie. He said, Gary, was it for real? He always said that, is it for real? And I said, yeah, Bernie, it was for real. So, time goes forward again. And we get to the part of the story that I have more difficulty telling about. In 2013, both men died within 2 months of each other. I mean, within 2 months. Both funerals were held at St. Patrick's Church, the same church I had attended. And you know, and I went back to the church. The church had been renovated, but it looked largely the same. They kept the old pews. When I sat in those pews, I was transported back 50 years. I mean, this wasn't deja vu. I was there. I was that little kid again. I was sitting in those pews, my feet dangling, not, you know, my legs weren't long enough to touch the ground, you know? It was just being back there. And there was a big difference though. Both these two guys I worshiped, they were both gone. So, at the second funeral, my uncle's funeral, my cousin's husband, Tom, gave the eulogy. Tom has a great voice for public speaking, not like me, great voice. And he climbed up this huge pulpit at the front of the church, and he told fish story after fish story about these guys. And I was enjoying it. And I was sure my uncle and my dad were looking down on the ceremony and enjoying it as well. And I was sitting in those pews with the only two people that are here tonight that knew the story of the doctored fish photo. My sister and my wife. I was sitting in a place that defined guilt for me. I was defined my relationship with God. It was the epicenter of all the guilt I've ever felt in my life. Now you make me laugh, I shouldn't. Okay. In the middle of this, in the eulogy, he's telling the fish stories. Tom looked down at me. Now the church was full. I mean full. And I'm sitting up the front row with the family, and he looked at me. And I'm like, he's looking at me. I mean, he looked at me. And he says, your dad never got over that picture. Your uncle, I mean, never got over that picture of your dad with the fish. What have I done? God, the church, the head community, I've lied. I shall not lie. My whole fishing life flashed before my eyes. All great places they took me fishing, all the wonderful lessons they taught me about life, their snobbery about fly fishing, that photo that we faked, that fish I caught in Vineyard Sound, the fish stories they told me, the quaggas, the fish stories, that story about the quaggas and the fish stories. The fish stories. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. These two guys had passed away, and people that are close to me, when they pass away, there's usually some sort of a message, and I really hadn't heard anything. Or had I? You bastards. You bastards, this is another fish story. And you caught me in hook, line, and sinker, just like I was a little boy. I mean, you guys fabricated this beyond the grave. This is a fish story that transcends death. How did you do it? Well, Dad, Bernie, I love you guys. One last lesson for me, I guess, huh? Life, yeah, and maybe even death is a fish story. But it's never just about fishing, is it?